pleased to be here. I have not been in this part of Kentucky very much. I'm relatively new to Kentucky anyway, so this is very exciting for me, and it's wonderful to come in at this point in your workshop because you've already heard the whole introduction to my talk. I usually I speak mostly to middle school and high school students, and I do think it's really important to raise with them the question of, why did it happen? And for me to understand the causes of the Holocaust and how that whole system developed is so important, because what are we studying the Holocaust for? Sure, we want to know what happened and we want to learn about the concentration camps, but for us to be able to move forward, we need to know why, and we need to know about the process. And so I prefer to really talk about some of that part of the Holocaust. I don't talk about the concentration camps at all. I tell my story because I think what happened to my family is a good illustration of how Hitler and the Nazis were able to mobilize the German population to go along with their program. And to me, that's the important question, because Germany at this time was a modern, industrialized, urbanized country, long tradition of great religiosity, Catholic in the south, Protestant Lutheran in the north and east, and a high culture. So of all places to go along with this kind of a horrendous activity is very difficult to understand. And so what I like to do is to use my story as a one part of the answer. It's a complicated answer. Anti-Semitism, as you've heard, and especially its modern usage and development, is a very important one. And this ubiquity of using every medium at your command, the newspapers, magazines, movies, radio, it all fit in together. But I'm just going to go through my story, and I'd like us to have as much time as possible for questions afterwards. So our family lived in the southwest corner of Germany in a little town called Penzingen. It was a very old town, founded in 1249, which always amazes the people in the United States, because I come from the East where we think 1700s or 1600s are old, but this was a town that dates back even further. It was built in a sort of a defensive style with a wall all around it, and you can see that the city was very clustered in, and the farms were all around, mostly farmers. It was very agricultural. When we lived there, it was about 1,000 people. The arrow points to one of the main industrial commercial streets in the village, and you can see the church is right in back of that street. So this is the house my family lived in that village. My family had come from Alsace, from the French side of the Rhine, and moved to Germany in the middle of the 18th century, actually the beginning of the 18th century, about the time that colonial rule here in North America was the general mode. My great-grandfather left the original village of Sullivan to move to this town, Kensington, to open a store. He saw commercial possibilities here. So he bought this house. The picture on the right is what it looks like now. You can see that structurally it's still very much the same. It's been modernized a little bit. But the store was on the first floor. My grandparents, well, the family lived on the next two stories, and in my time, my family lived on the third floor. And my grandparents lived on the second floor, and the store was on the first floor. The store did very well for itself. My grandfather, who was a gay 90s type, ran the store and married a woman from a nearby village. Both of them were very observant Jews, but my grandmother was blonde and blue-eyed, which usually blows the students away because this is the typical Aryan look. They had 5 sons. One of them died in infancy, but these are the 4 who survived, and my father is the one on the left. They were very active in their schools. They were very much integrated into the village life. This was a village where there were only 3 or 4 Jewish families at any one time. So even of the 1,000, there were maybe, I don't know, maybe 20 were Jews. So again, it was a very, very small part of the general population. And they were totally integrated with the non-Jewish Catholic. It's in southern Germany, so it was Catholic. And they were very integrated, very active in school, in the glee clubs and the JAMA Society. My father was a good soccer player, so they felt themselves very much a part of the community. This is my father as a member of the soccer team. If you look carefully, you'll see there's a soldier on the right, so this must have been taken just after the First World War. My father and his older brother, in fact, enlisted in the Army in the First World War because they wanted to fight for their fatherland. And they both survived the war. After the war, my father came back, and his father at that point said, I want to give up the business and retire. And so my father agreed that he would take it over. His older brother and his 2 younger brothers all said, no, we're not staying in the village. We want to go into the cities because that's where the action is. And we think we can have better lives in the cities. But my father agreed that he would stay in the store. But he had to learn how to run the business, and so he went to the nearby city of Freiburg. It's a big, important city, still is, has a very well-known university, especially for medical purposes, and has a very beautiful cathedral. Freiburg is still very much a center of activity. It is now the center of the ecological movement. It's a green city in Germany. So he went here to learn how to be a store owner and to learn business practices. He became an apprentice. And it was there that he met my mother. My mother grew up in Freiburg. My mother's the middle one. These are 3 cousins. Each one of them was an only child, and they were very close to each other. Let me go back a minute. My mother and father met in Freiburg in the city, and they were married in 1930, and I was born in 1931. I was the only child for both sets of grandparents, hence lots of toys. I was very spoiled. Things were going really, really well for this family in this little village. The store was doing very well. My father had bought a car, and his was the first car to be owned by anyone in the village. It was a green Opel. And he used it to take merchandise from the store into the countryside. The store, by this time, it was a dry goods store, and he was specialized in fabrics. And he had very nice imported fabrics, woolens from England, velvets from silk from France, some of the local materials, and he was known as having really good stuff, and he would go into the countryside and sell it so that the farmers who lived around the outskirts wouldn't have to come in and to buy. He was well known and well liked everywhere, and my mother had learned how to play the piano when she was a little girl, and so she was very popular in the village because she had a piano, and it was a great time. Life was good. These were a very happy couple, and everything seemed to be going very well. And I was also very much a part of village life. And then in 1933, Hitler came to power, and everything changed. One of the first things that happened was that my father was told that he could no longer be a member of the soccer team. Every village had its own soccer team, and he was one of their star players. And he was told he could no longer play because, of course, everyone knew that Jews were inferior physically. That was part of the propaganda. And the law was passed that Jews were no longer to be members of sports teams. And so my father had to withdraw from the soccer team. And nobody on that team stood up and said, this is ridiculous. He's a good player, why should we give him up? They were all good Germans. The law said you have to get rid of Jews on your team. And so they did. They may have hoped that it would change eventually, but they didn't argue with it. And so he had to withdraw. In the spring of 1934, just a short time later, my father, who had a good voice, was a member of the Glee Club, was singing in the spring concert of the Glee Club. And at the end of the concert, the director suggested everyone stand up and we're going to sing the German national anthem. Well, by this time, my father already knew what that meant as far as he was concerned at being a Jew. And so he didn't stand up. Resistance. Someone told me many years later that we kicked him out of that glee club as if he had been a mongrel dog. So he left. And my family became more and more isolated within this community of which they had been such an integrated part. People stopped visiting. They stopped asking my mother to play the piano. My father, who was a great card player, used to love to just walk to his buddies' homes, always welcome. He stopped. When I went out in the street to play, this was by this time I was, well, I was 3 years old, 4 years old, I would be told to get off the sidewalk. I'm polluting the sidewalk. I'm a dirty Jew. Get into the house. As a little tiny child. My friends, or those who used to come to play at my house because I had such nice toys, they stopped coming. And so by 1935, my family was isolated within this village. There were one or two people or families who still maintained contact, who went against the norm. But by and large, people refused to have any more social interaction with us. They still came to the store and they bought things. It was the only dry goods store in the village. They needed that store. But they did not interact with us socially anymore at all. And then in 1935, there was a whole series of laws passed that you may know about. They defined Jews as anyone who had one grandparent with Jewish blood. So it wasn't just if you declared yourself by the census or if you belonged to a synagogue. It was if you had an ancestor going back 2 generations who was Jewish, then you were also Jewish. And you might have been mixed because you might have had one parent or grandparent who was non-Jewish, but conversion didn't count. That was one of the major laws. The other law that had impacted all Jews in Germany at once was that Jews were declared non-citizens. So here my family was. They'd been living in Germany for almost 200 years, and suddenly they were told that they were no longer citizens of their country. My father had fought for the German army, and that meant a great many things, including that they were no longer entitled to equal protection under the law or to protection from the police or from the military. At the end of 1935, Hitler declared a boycott of Jewish stores. And suddenly my father's store was off limits. Now, it was the only store in town that sold this, so it was a bit of a hardship not to have the dry goods store available, but people obeyed the law, in part because they wanted to, they believed this, they believed the propaganda, but in part it was also because the Gestapo was stationed on either side of the store, a little bit down the street, but on that block, there was one Gestapo on one side, one on the other side, and they would keep track of anybody who broke the boycott and who would walk into that store to buy. And that next day, that family would get a knock on the door and the Gestapo would be there and say, okay, we saw you buying in that Jew store. If that happens again, your family will be in trouble. Well, that was a serious threat because there had been lots of arrests and lots of killings. And so people were very intimidated. The one person in the village who was not intimidated was the Catholic priest, who on Sundays would stand up and he would rail against the Nazi laws. And he would tell his parishioners, if you don't want to go into the store openly, then go at night, go in the back door, help this family out. And some did. So we were able to barely survive, but business was down to about 10% of what it had been before that boycott began. Well, about this time, my parents decided, by now it was 1936, my parents decided that this was not a good place in which to bring up a child. And so they started looking around to see where they could go. And you remember we talked about it was one thing to be able to get out, but it's another thing to be able to get in. And so they considered a variety of options. England at that time was accepting Jewish children, but they didn't want adults. And there were kinder transport trains that were specific to transporting children out of Europe into to England specifically. The U.S. also took a few children. Palestine was closed to Jewish immigration. The British controlled it, and they had closed it. So there were very few options. The United States was, we considered our best bet because my mother had a first cousin, one of those little girls in the picture, had already moved to the United States. So we thought through her we might be able to get in. The United States was, the State Department was very anti-Semitic at the time. And they actually issued a directive to their consulates in Germany to say, make it as difficult as possible for Jewish refugees to get into the United States. So we had a lot of hurdles to overcome. You had to be able to get an affidavit, a letter saying somebody is going to support you once you get to the US so that you don't end up in the welfare rolls. And you had to go through this whole application process. Before the time of Xerox, before the time even of mimeograph, everything had to be typed and then copied, you know, with carbon copies and sent in by mail. There was very little airmail, so most of the correspondence went by sea mail. So it took 3 weeks to get one way and 3 weeks to come back the other way. So it was a long, drawn-out process. My family went through this whole application process. It took most of the half of a year, and it finally all got into the consulate in Germany, and they never heard from the consulate. And every day they would look, see what was in the mail. Nothing came. My father sent them registered letters, never an answer. Finally, he called and they said, "Oh, we don't have any record of your application. You will have to reapply." So they're following this directive, you know, make it hard. So we had to go through the whole thing all over again. So it's 36, 37 has come along. Business is going downhill. And I was in a position to get to school. But by this time, among the many other laws that were passed, was one that said Jewish children cannot attend public schools. So my parents educated me at home when I was 6, but by the time I was 7 in 37, 38, when I should have been going to school, they said, "You've got to do something." And so they looked around, and there was a school, a Jewish school, set up in the city where my mother's parents lived, in Freiburg. And they thought that that would be a possibility for me, that I would go live with my grandparents and go to Jewish school. It was, it was embedded in this school, the Lessing School. It's a large school. This is the front of it. In back, there was a playground, and there were a couple of back doors. There were 2 rooms dedicated to the Jewish students. We could go in through the back, where we would never mix with the regular German students coming in. We would go through the back door and go into the basement, and there were the 2 rooms where we had our classes. We were only allowed to use the playground during those periods when there was no other classes were outside, so that we never ever mixed with the German children who were in that school. But at least I was able to begin to get an education. And there were only 6 of us in grades 1 through 3. And the other one was grades 4 through 6. The high school met in a different location. What we among the topics we learned, other than the general topics, we started to learn English, and we started to learn Hebrew, because the hope was that we would emigrate, and that we would somehow get either into the United States or somehow get into Palestine. And so that was part of the thinking and part of the curriculum at the time. Well, I was actually living with my grandparents in Freiburg and going to this school in November of 1938, 80 years ago last Friday, when a great pogrom was unleashed in Germany. It's called Kristallnacht. The Germans are beginning to change the name and calling it Pogromnacht. You know what the word pogrom means? It's a government-sanctioned violence against Jews. and it's a Russian word because it was used in Russia extensively before the Nazi period in the 1870s and 80s, and that was one of the causes for emigration at that time. But they unleashed this program throughout Germany, and it was so well organized that it went from the very largest cities like Berlin and Frankfurt all the way down to the villages like the one in which I live. One of the things that happened was that the synagogues all the synagogues throughout Germany were vandalized and burned. This was the synagogue that I attended in Freiburg. It was a very prominent one, right in the center of town on a little hill. Couldn't miss it. This is what it looked like after Kristallnacht. And I remember walking by and seeing the smoldering embers on that synagogue. All of the Jewish-owned shops were vandalized. If they had windows of any kind, the windows were broken, and the merchandise, what was left in there, was vandalized. It was destroyed or it was looted. In the village where my family lived, in this little tiny village, there was one Jewish store, my father's, which had already been practically closed because of the boycott. But there was a little bit left. The night of Kristallnacht, a group of men came into that village, went to that store, smashed down the windows, smashed down the doors, went inside and looted the store. There was very little left, but they took whatever there was and they threw it outside into the streets. They had been extremely well briefed because they knew to go up to the third floor where the owner of the store lived, my father, and my mother. They were there, totally alone. They had heard about what was going on. They were terrified, and they had hoped to remain as invisible as possible. This group of men went up to that third floor. They broke down the door to the apartment, went in and threw all the books that my parents had out the window. And they also took my mother's sheet music and threw that out. My mother never played the piano again after that night. They piled everything in the street and they lit a bonfire. And they kept that fire going as long as they could with the books and the sheet music and whatever merchandise had remained in the store. The next morning, an open truck came into the village. It was a beautiful day, so it was very visible, and people could see it. And some people told me that they saw that truck coming in, and they took their children and put them in an inside room and closed the shutters because they didn't want them to see what was going on. They collected the Jewish men who were aged 16 and over. So in our village, that was my father and my grandfather, and my grandmother's brother and his son. And those were the only Jewish men left in the village. But those 4 were put on the truck. And then that truck went to the next village, collected, again, a handful of Jewish men. And they went from village to village until the truck was full, took them to the railroad station, put them on a train, and they ended up in Dachau. Dachau was the first concentration camp that Hitler built the minute he became chancellor. It was the very first one. It was full by this time, by 1938, of anybody who had spoken up against Hitler. So there were a lot of political prisoners there. There were Seventh-day Adventists there. There were people who were gay. In this area, there were probably also some gypsies because there were a great many Roma gypsy people who lived in southwestern Germany. And so when, after Kristallnacht, the Jewish men were deposited. They were also deposited in 2 other concentration camps in Germany, in Sachsenhausen and Buchenwald. This is what the layout of the camp was. It was crowded to begin with, and suddenly thousands more Jewish men were poured into the camp. So you can imagine what conditions must have been like. They were, we all have visions of the famous picture with Elie Wiesel where they're fleet to a bunk. Well, this was probably even worse. And it was a horrendous situation with no medical care, almost no sanitation. And the Nazis were really concerned that might be a lot of disease spreading very quickly. It would not have been surprising, and they were afraid that they might also contact something. So they decided that they would try to decompress the crowding in the camp, and they let all the men aged 16 over out within a week. They shouldn't have been collected in the first place, is the thinking. But that meant that both my grandfathers by this time were in this camp, so they were both allowed to leave quite early on, and they came back. After that, they said they also allowed people to pay ransom to get out. So there were some Jewish families still had access to funds, and they were able to leave. And then finally they said, okay, we want to make Germany Judenrein, clean of Jews, because Jews were seen as polluters. They were not human beings. They were somewhere lower than vermin, but they had to be cleaned out. And so they said, okay, we want Jews to get out of Germany. Anybody who can prove that they're about to leave Germany will be able to get out of the camp so that you can get out of Germany. So the priest helped my mother go to the Gestapo with the documents we had, the carbon copies of our applications to leave Germany and come to the United States. And on the basis of that, after about 5.5 weeks, my father was released from Dachau. And anyone who was released from Dachau was made to swear that they would never talk about what happened there again. He never talked to me about it. I'm sure my mother knew. But my father brought with him a souvenir from Dachau. This is the original yellow star that he was issued when he was a prisoner there. Dachau was really the first place where yellow stars were used to identify Jews. They had used green triangles and pink triangles and yellow triangles for other groups, but when the Jews came in, they used the double triangle to make the Jewish star, and they wrote the word Jude in it. It was a very crude business. They apparently gave them metal templates, and then they gave them this fabric to sew on around the template, the form, so that they would have the yellow star. They stopped using the metal as soon as the war began because this became a precious commodity. But this was, my father always called it his graduation certificate from Dachau. He had a fantastic sense of humor, which really helped him to survive. So here we are in 1938, the end of 1938. School stopped because everything was broken up and torn. We couldn't meet anymore. And business was, of course, completely destroyed. Bank accounts were frozen so that you did not have access to your own bank account anymore, unless for you could petition to take money out for particular reasons. Jews could no longer own real estate, so we had to sell the house that my great-grandfather had bought back in 1864. And we sold it, of course, for a lot less than it was worth, and then we had to pay rent to continue living in it. You can imagine how much my parents really, really wanted to get out. So they started again with the embassy, and was it any possibility? By this time, though, the Germans had also created a problem for themselves. They had said Jews are no longer citizens of Germany. Well, if you're going to travel overseas, there's certain documents you need. One of them is what? A passport. But how can you get a passport if you're not a citizen? And so the Germans decided that they would issue ID cards, and I have copies here if you want to look at it more closely. You can just sort of pass these around. That they would issue ID cards for Jews, and that with those ID cards you could then apply for a passport as long as you knew you were going to leave. So this is my father's ID card, and you will see that he signs his name, Siegfried Israel Dreyfus. All the Jewish men in Germany by this time had to have the name Israel. And all the women, as you'll see, my mothers, had to have the name Sarah. Because the Nazis said they're not human beings, they don't need to be distinguished one from the other, we'll just group them all together, they'll be Israel and Sarah, and that will identify them. That's all the identification they need. And there's also a big J on there to indicate that they were Jewish. The photographs are interesting. You'll see that it's a kind of a three-quarter view with backlighting. because the photographers were told, you need to do it that way, it makes the nose look bigger. And the whole propaganda against the Jews always showed them with big noses. So this was a way of proving that and showing it in documents. It's my mother's picture. Someone said Jews really didn't need ID cards because you could just look at their traumatized faces and see that they were Jewish, and I think my mother explains this very well. This is mine. And I remember having that picture taken because when you have your picture taken, what do people tell you? Smile, sure. Everybody's supposed to smile. So I wasn't any different. And I went up there and I sat down and I smiled. And the photographer really yelled at me, and it traumatized me. That's why I still remember it. You know, wipe that dirty smile off your face. You're a Jew, you have nothing to smile about. So I tried real hard. But once we had these ID cards, we had great hopes that we would be able to get to the United States. And these were issued in February. Sure enough, in May of that year, we were advised by the embassy, the consulate in Germany near us, that we were approved for a visa, and that as long as we had our passports, we'd come to the consulate and they would stamp the passport. Germans said, no, you have to have the visa first. We can't issue a passport unless we know that you have the visa. So, you know, again, we were caught in this terrible, terrible bureaucratic bind just to make it harder for us. But eventually the U.S. relented and said, okay, we will issue a provisional visa, and then once you get your passport, you bring that in and we'll stamp them. And so we were able to get a visa from the consulate, and we were sent immediately a long letter from the German authorities that, first of all, that we had to pay a very steep exit tax. So that we had to petition the government to allow us to get access to our bank account so that we could pay the taxes, which they did. Then we were told that we would have to also make sure that we had passage on a ship before we would get final papers. And so we were able to book passage for a ship leaving Hamburg at the end of the summer in August. And we were fortunate to be able to get room on that ship. And I think the passage was something like $50 a ticket in those days. And then we were told that when you leave Germany, per family, you can take one steamer trunk. So that's, you know, a little bit bigger than a camp locker, but not much. And you can take clothing from that along with you and papers. Nothing of value. No. The only jewelry that you will be allowed to take is wedding bands for married couples and watches. If you are 16 or older, you could either have a pocket watch or a wristwatch. And each person is allowed to take along the equivalent of $5. And so at the end of July, beginning of August, we arranged for our transportation ticket chain from this village in the southwestern corner of Germany to go to Hamburg, which is in the northwest. And we had with us the steamer trunk, and my parents had their wedding rings and their watches. I used to have earrings. I had pierced ears. I had to take those out. And we boarded the ship on August 15th to go directly to New York. We arrived in New York on August 28th. 13 days. Imagine having take 13 days to cross the Atlantic. We now would consider that an outrageous amount of hours to take to cross the Atlantic. We took 13 days because the ship zigzagged. They were afraid that there would be U-boats in the Atlantic, and they didn't want to have a Lusitania incident again. And so the ship zigzagged its way across the Atlantic and finally arrived in New York on August 28th. As you know, the war broke out on September 1st, so we arrived 3 days before the war broke out. Our ship was the last passenger liner to leave Germany on schedule. I've always thought there must have been some angel somewhere looking out for us. And we began a new life.